but also had a great many opportunities to work with Ukraine's army and their senior leadership. And I'll talk a little bit about that, plus my experiences with the Russian army and how those relationships really kind of give me some insight on what may be happening now. I mean, there has been no stated objectives by Mr. Putin as he went into the war. So these are my conclusions as what he was attempting to do from a strategic standpoint. His number one priority was to execute regime change, get rid of President Zelensky and his cabinet. He wanted desperately to control the Black and Azov seaports because that would strangle the economic situation in Ukraine, as well as Mr. Putin was in the process of opening up the Nord Stream pipeline. So if he could control the oil or the energy reserves into Europe and at the same time control some of the exports of Ukraine, that was probably his secondary strategic objective. Third strategic objective, which you always have to do when you're trying to subjugate a country, is to destroy Ukraine's army. His initial attempt to do that was an envelopment, and you'll see in the far west those two arrows going from the north to the south and the south to the north. He believed that the majority of Ukraine's army was in the Donbass region, that eastern oblast, which combines Luhansk and Donetsk province. So he thought by enveloping those two armies with attacks from the north and south, that he could quickly destroy the Ukraine's army while at the same time attacking into the capital and taking over the government. Mr. Putin also believed he could subjugate Ukraine's population and turn them back into a Soviet satellite or a Russian satellite. And then finally, I think one of his objectives that he's been attempting over the last probably 15 years is to further divide NATO. And he saw an opportunity based on the contention in our internal politics in the United States to further divide the United States in terms of their decision-making on what we would do should he attack. I believe he honestly thought that NATO would stand by and watch this without any external action. And I believe that he thought that the United States was so divided that it would not come together in terms of our political strategy or our objectives in Ukraine. And as you can see, as we used to say at the National Training Center, how'd he do? If you think these are the 5 objectives, strategic objectives that he had going into this fight, I would suggest he's failed in every single one of them so far. There are some people, in fact, I heard an expert yesterday say that Mr. Putin has strategically already lost this war. And what he's just trying to do now is adjust. It's important to see what happened in the first phase of the operation. Russia did not know their enemy. They did not understand the transformation that the Ukrainian army has gone through over the last 15 years. And they certainly didn't know themselves. There was a lot of sycophantic input from the military and the ministries to Mr. Putin himself. And while all of that we can do anything type of voice was being exhibited by those generals and by those ministers, I can tell you without going into any details, that during the last 10 years of my career, I watched very closely the corruption and the grift that was occurring inside the Russian army and how it was going south because there was a lot of people pocketing acquisition funds. But in addition to knowing the enemy and knowing yourself, you also have to know the ground and the weather in order to have a total victory. This is a picture of me having a conversation with a guy named General Strykov, who from 2009 to 2011 was my counterpart as the commander of the Russian ground forces. We had just concluded a visit that had lasted about 2 weeks, where he, for the first time in his career, had visited Germany to see the troops that we had and the kind of training they were going through. And in this setting, he asked me a very simple question after seeing our troops for about 2 weeks. He said, "General, what makes your army so good?" I won't tell you, and you can see the surprised look on my face because I didn't expect him to be that transparent after a visit. But I told him that primarily it was our leadership, our sense of values, and the ability of our NCO Corps to conduct operations. And a success or failure of large-scale operations always centers on whether or not you can support it logistically. But the artillery duels that are going on now are devastatingly intense, chaotic, and catastrophic. The difference between this fight and the one that occurred 100 years ago in 1918 is the Russians are purposely targeting not their enemy soldiers, but the enemy or their enemy Ukrainian civilians. And it is causing a great deal of death and destruction, as well as the execution of war crimes. We built cave complexes at the Hohenfels training area in near Grafenberg, Germany, for US forces as they were going into Afghanistan. Those two top pictures were the before and after of a cave that we built to train our forces. It was a simple subterranean cave. They have the same thing at our National Training Center in Fort Irwin, California. The bottom picture shows the challenges of the Mariupol's Azovstal steel plant. It was 6 levels deep. It spanned over 14 square miles of terrain. The top part of the building, the top part of the land was the steel plant itself, but this plant was designed as a nuclear fallout facility in case of attack during the Cold War. So Ukrainian Soviet forces could have stayed in the basement of this thing for a very long time, the 6 levels of basement, and traveled throughout. This is why the Russian forces had such difficulty dislodging the Mariupol fighters for a period of a month. What happened in this fight, though, is those 1,500 or so fighters defended this location against 12 to 14, not really sure how many, battalion tactical groups of the Russian army. That's a total of about 15,000 or so soldiers. So it was 1,000 to 15,000 in terms of odds. And the holding of those forces there actually stopped further advances by the Russian forces to the north. So this will go down as the equivalent of the Alamo or the Battle of the Bulge or Bastogne or any of the historical places in world history where a very small number of defenders held off a very large number of attackers. I was told a long time ago by a very smart military guy that you can tell who's going to win a fight by determining the amount of resources times the amount of will that they have. Russia had significantly more resources than Ukrainian army at the beginning, but the will of the Ukrainian force far outmatched their Russian opponents. And from the very beginning of the war, I was one of the few national security analysts that said Ukraine was going to come out on top of this, and I still believe that.